Okay, so you want to own a Victorian coaching inn. You picture a warm fire, a full stable, a steady stream of travelers arriving by carriage every evening, a business built on hospitality and word of mouth. Then you open one surviving toll ledger from the 1830s. In a single decade, the mileage of railway track open in Britain went from a few dozen miles to well over 1,000. And by the 1840s, a journey that once took a coach 4 days could be done by train in under 12 hours.
That's the part the romantic version leaves out. The Victorian inn wasn't a stable, slow-growing hospitality business. It was a trade sitting directly in the path of the single fastest piece of technological disruption the 19th century produced. And whether you got rich or went bankrupt often had nothing to do with how well you ran your inn at all. Let's build one and prove it. One coaching inn, a stable of horses, a tap room, guest rooms, and the road it sat on, somewhere in provincial England, in the early 1800s, before the railways arrived. By the end, you'll have the real ledger. What it costs to run an inn built around road traffic. Where the actual profit came from. The single piece of infrastructure that decided whether you got rich or went broke. And why the innkeepers who survived the century were almost never the ones who simply ran the best inn. First, let's kill the image of an inn as a purely local hospitality business. A proper Georgian or early Victorian coaching inn was, functionally, 3 overlapping businesses running under one roof. There was the accommodation side, rooms and beds for overnight travelers. There was the tap room and dining side, food and drink sold to travelers and locals alike. And there was the transport servicing side, arguably the most capital-intensive of the 3. Stabling, feeding, and changing horses for the mail coaches and stagecoach services that ran fixed routes on fixed schedules, stopping at specific inns not by chance, but by contract. That third business is the one people forget entirely, and it's the one that generated the steadiest, highest volume income of the 3, because a coaching inn under contract to a mail or stage route had guaranteed, scheduled custom arriving whether the weather was good or the taproom was full or empty that night. So who actually controlled which inns got that guaranteed business? Not the innkeeper alone. Coaching contracts were negotiated with coach proprietors, and, for the mail route specifically, with the post office, which by the early 1800s ran a tightly scheduled national mail coach network with fixed stops for changing horses roughly every 10 to 15 miles along major routes. An inn positioned on a well-traveled route, at the right distance from the last stop, with stabling sufficient to hold and rest coach horses, held something close to a small local monopoly on that route's overnight and horse-changing trade. An inn 1 mile off the main road, however charming, got almost none of it. This is the first number that reframes everything. Location wasn't a preference for a coaching inn, it was the entire business model, decided not by the innkeeper, but by which roads the coach proprietors and the post office chose to run their fixed schedules along. Now price the actual operation. The stable was the single largest capital investment for a serious coaching inn, and it needed to be large. A busy route could see a dozen or more coaches passing through in a single day during peak periods, each needing horses changed, fed, watered, and rested, which meant an inn on a major route needed to maintain a rotating stock of dozens of horses, along with the ostlers, grooms, and farriers to manage them. Add the accommodation side. Enough rooms furnished to a standard that could plausibly host a gentleman traveler or a merchant, since coaching inns served a real cross-section of society moving through on business, not just poor travelers with no alternative. And the tap room and kitchen, which needed enough capacity and staff to feed dozens of travelers on short notice whenever a coach pulled in. Compare that to the medieval tavern this channel covered before, built around a single fixed local customer base with modest overhead. A serious coaching inn on a major route was a fundamentally larger, more capital-intensive operation, closer in scale to a small transport depot than a simple public house, because, in the most literal sense, that's exactly what a portion of it was. The twist that made this business genuinely lucrative for well-positioned owners in the late 1700s and early 1800s was volume and predictability layered on top of each other.
Unlike a tavern dependent purely on passing local trade, a coaching inn under contract had scheduled, guaranteed custom multiple times a day, every day, for horse changing alone, plus whatever additional overnight and dining trade that regular coach traffic naturally generated as travelers stopped, ate, and sometimes stayed the night. Surviving accounts from prosperous coaching inns on major routes, the Great North Road, the road to Bath, the route between London and Dover, describe innkeepers on these routes among the wealthiest tradesmen in their towns, in some cases genuinely rivaling local merchants and minor gentry in visible wealth, built on decades of that steady, contracted horse-changing income compounding year after year. Climb the actual revenue ladder, then, because the inn wasn't one flat business any more than the tavern or the vineyard were.
At the base sat the taproom trade, food and drink, modest margin, constant, the equivalent of the blacksmith's nails. Above that sat overnight accommodation, carrying a healthier margin, especially from higher-paying travelers willing to pay for a private room and a good meal rather than share a common area. At the top sat the coaching contract itself, the horse-changing and mail-servicing income, lower in visible glamour, but the highest in volume, and the most reliably scheduled income of the three, arriving on a fixed timetable set by the post office and coach proprietors regardless of local conditions on any given night.
The wealthiest coaching-era innkeepers positioned themselves deliberately to capture all three layers at once on the busiest possible route, which is exactly why competition for the best coaching contracts on major roads was fierce, and why losing a coaching contract to a rival inn down the road could gut an innkeeper's income, even if his tap room and rooms stayed just as busy as before. Now, the part of this story that turns the entire trade on its head, because this is genuinely one of the sharpest cautionary tales in economic history for what happens when your entire business model depends on a piece of infrastructure you don't control. Starting in the 1830s and accelerating through the 1840s, Britain's railway network expanded at a pace almost nothing in the pre-industrial economy had prepared merchants for. A journey between London and Birmingham that took a stagecoach roughly 2 full days could be completed by train in a matter of hours once the London and Birmingham Railway opened in 1838. Mail contracts that had sustained coaching inns for a century began shifting to the railways almost as fast as track could be laid, because the post office had no sentimental attachment to the old coaching network. It simply wanted mail moved as fast and as cheaply as possible, and the railways offered both. The result was one of the fastest, most complete collapses of an established trade in 19th century Britain. Coaching inns on routes bypassed by the new rail lines saw their guaranteed horse-changing income evaporate within a few short years, sometimes within months of a competing railway line opening nearby. Stables built to hold dozens of horses stood empty. Ostlers and grooms who'd built careers around coach traffic found their skills suddenly far less in demand. Contemporary accounts from the period described once prosperous coaching towns falling into visible decline as the traffic that had sustained them for generations simply stopped arriving, rerouted onto rails that ran parallel to, but rarely directly through, the old coaching stops. An innkeeper who had spent decades building the finest stable and the best positioned inn on the Great North Road could watch that entire investment become worthless in less time than it had taken to build the reputation in the first place, through no failure of his own management whatsoever. Not every inn died, though, and the ones that survived reveal exactly where the real skill in this business actually sat. Some innkeepers, seeing the shift early enough, repositioned their properties toward the railway itself, inns built or rebuilt near new stations, catering to the fresh wave of rail travelers who still needed food, drink, and occasional lodging, just delivered by a different mode of transport arriving on a different schedule. Others leaned harder into the accommodation and dining layers of the business, cultivating a reputation strong enough to draw travelers who now had a faster journey and therefore more disposable time and money to spend once they arrived. The innkeepers who survived the railway transition weren't necessarily the ones who'd run the best coaching-era inn. They were the ones who understood earliest that their business had never really been about horses or roads specifically.
It had been about capturing travelers passing through, by whatever mechanism travelers happened to be passing through at the time. It's worth being specific about the staffing structure behind a major coaching inn because it's easy to picture the innkeeper as a single figure when the reality was closer to running a small transport company. Ostlers managed the stable day-to-day, responsible for having fresh horses ready and tired ones cooled, fed, and rested within the tight turnaround windows a mail contract demanded, since a late change could throw off an entire route's published schedule and risk the contract itself. Farriers kept horses properly shod for the punishing mileage coaching work put on them.
Chambermaids, cooks, and waiters ran the accommodation and dining side in parallel, often on entirely separate shift patterns dictated by when coaches were scheduled to arrive, rather than by any predictable local dining hour. A genuinely busy coaching inn on a major route could employ a staff numbering into the dozens, making it, in employment terms, one of the largest single businesses in many provincial English towns of the period. A detail that also explains why a coaching contract's loss didn't just hurt the innkeeper's income, it could visibly damage the local town economy that had grown up around servicing that traffic. It's also worth noting how innkeepers on the busiest routes manage the very real risk of a competing inn undercutting their coaching contract, because the tactics look strikingly modern. Some innkeepers invested heavily and visibly in stable quality and turnaround speed specifically to make their inn the reliable choice for coach proprietors renewing contracts, understanding that reputation for consistency mattered as much to a coach proprietor as the price of the arrangement itself, since a late or poorly managed horse change reflected badly on the entire route schedule. Others cultivated relationships directly with coach proprietors and, where possible, with post office contractors, treating those relationships as the genuine core asset of the business, rather than the physical building or stable itself. A recognition decades before anyone used the language that the contract was worth more than the property it was performed on. Now, the risk side more broadly, because even setting aside the railway disruption, this was a genuinely volatile trade. Weather could close roads for days, cutting off coach traffic and the income that came with it. Competition for coaching contracts was intense enough that losing one to a rival inn a few miles down the road could happen with little warning, especially as coach proprietors periodically renegotiated routes and stops in search of better terms. And the capital tied up in a large stable, dozens of horses, and staff to manage them, was a genuinely illiquid investment, nearly impossible to repurpose quickly if the coaching trade on a given route declined, which is precisely the trap that caught so many innkeepers when the railways arrived faster than anyone in the trade had predicted. So, could you get rich owning a Victorian inn? For much of the late Georgian and early Victorian period, yes, spectacularly, if you controlled the right stretch of the right road and captured a coaching contract that layered guaranteed, scheduled income on top of your taproom and accommodation trade. But that wealth was built on an infrastructure dependency almost nobody in the trade fully appreciated until it was too late. The entire coaching economy existed because moving people and mail by road was, for a few crucial decades, the fastest available option. And the moment a faster option arrived, the value embedded in a stable full of horses and a well-positioned taproom evaporated faster than almost any other established trade of the era. The innkeepers who stayed wealthy through the railway age weren't the ones who'd built the best coaching business. They were the ones who understood that the coach, the stable, and the mail contract had never really been the business at all. Look back at the old coaching road one last time, without the sound of hooves on cobblestone. A Victorian inn was never really a hospitality business built purely on food, drink, and a warm bed. For decades, it was a transport utility wearing a hospitality business's face, capturing guaranteed income from a fixed, scheduled national network that could vanish the instant a faster network replaced it. The room sold what everyone assumes it sold. The stable and the coaching contract sold something else entirely, a monopoly on a specific stretch of a specific road, valid only for as long as that road remained the fastest way to travel. The inn was never the business. The road was, right up until it wasn't.